The door he never let me open. I used to tell myself that every marriage has its locked rooms. Not literal ones, of course. At least, that's what I believed back then. I told myself that love didn't mean knowing every thought your partner ever had. That trust meant accepting silence where explanations didn't come easily. That was before the study. My husband, Richard, had many habits that people found charming. He was orderly, disciplined. A man who folded his shirts with military precision and sharpened his pencils even in the age of laptops. He woke up at the same time every morning, drank his coffee black, and read the newspaper cover to cover like the world still moved at the pace it did in the 70s. But there was one habit that never sat right with me. The study was off limits. It was a narrow room at the end of the hallway, just past our bedroom. Dark oak door. Brass handle polished so often it caught the light even at dusk. Inside, I knew, were shelves of leather-bound books and filing cabinets so heavy they seemed welded to the floor. I knew because I had seen it once. Only once. It was early in our marriage, back when we still surprised each other. I had come home early from work, humming to myself, balancing groceries on my hip. The door was open just a crack. Enough for me to glimpse the inside. Enough to notice that the room felt different. Not cozy like the rest of the house. Not lived in. It felt preserved. Controlled. Like a museum exhibit curated by someone who didn't want fingerprints anywhere near the glass. Before I could take a step closer, Richard appeared behind me. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. "Please don't go in there," he said calmly. "Not can you, not I'd rather you didn't. Please don't." I laughed it off, embarrassed. I was just curious. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "That room is private," he said. "It needs to stay that way." I remember the chill that ran through me, not fear exactly, but a sense of being gently but firmly pushed back into my place. I nodded. And that was the end of it. Or so I thought. As the years passed, the study became a fact of life. Like the creaky step on the staircase, or the way the kitchen light flickered when the dishwasher ran. It was just there. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear him inside. The faint click of a lamp. The rustle of papers. The soft, steady sound of a man organizing secrets. If I asked what he was working on, he'd smile and say, "Old things. Things better left alone." And I'd let it go. Because that's what good wives do, right? We don't pry. We don't poke at old wounds. We trust. Or at least we pretend to. Richard died on a Tuesday. It was quiet. Almost disrespectfully so. One moment he was there, complaining about the weather, asking me to hand him his reading glasses. And the next, he was gone. A sudden stillness in his body that no amount of shaking could undo. The doctors called it peaceful. I didn't. There was nothing peaceful about the way silence rushed into our home afterward, filling every corner like water in a sinking ship. For weeks, I moved through the house like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Every room echoed with his absence. His mug by the sink. His coat still hanging by the door. And at the end of the hallway, the study. The door was closed, as always. But something had changed. For the first time in decades, there was no one left to tell me not to open it. The lawyer came a week later. A polite man with careful eyes and a voice trained to deliver bad news gently. We sat at the dining table, sunlight spilling between us, and he read through the will with practiced neutrality. There were no surprises. Or so it seemed. The house was mine. The accounts were divided exactly as expected. Modest charitable donations. Small bequests to distant relatives Richard rarely mentioned. Then the lawyer paused. "There is one additional instruction," he said slowly. "Your husband left a sealed letter. For you." My hands trembled as I took it. The envelope was thick, heavy. My name written in Richard's familiar handwriting. Precise, deliberate, unmistakably his. I waited until the lawyer left before opening it. The letter was short. Too short. My dearest. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the burden I carried now rests with you. The study was never meant to shut you out. It was meant to protect you. When you are ready, open the door. Everything you need to know is inside. There was no signature. Just his handwriting. Steady to the end. I sat there for a long time, letter clutched to my chest, heart pounding like it was trying to escape. Protect me from what? That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in our bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. The wind rattled the windows. The floorboards creaked like they were whispering among themselves. At some point, I found myself standing in the hallway, barefoot, robe wrapped tight around me, facing the door. The brass handle gleamed in the low light, innocent as ever. I reached out, then pulled my hand back. I wasn't ready. Not yet. But the seed had been planted. And once curiosity takes root, it doesn't stay quiet for long. Over the next few days, memories surfaced, things I had brushed aside for years. The way Richard flinched when certain names appeared on the news. The files he never let me organize. The phone calls he took outside, even in winter. The careful way he separated his past from our present. I had loved him. Deeply. Truly. But suddenly, I wondered how well I had known him at all. The morning I finally opened the door, the house was silent. No dramatic thunder. No ominous music. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the hallway clock. I placed my hand on the handle. It was cold. I turned it. The door opened easily, like it had been waiting for me. And when I stepped inside, I froze. Because this wasn't a study. It was a confession. What he hid in plain sight. The smell hit me first. Old paper. Leather. Dust layered over time. Not neglect, but intention. The kind of dust that settles only when nothing is ever moved without reason. The study was darker than the rest of the house, even in daylight. Heavy curtains muted the sun, allowing only thin golden lines to fall across the floor like prison bars. The air felt thicker, as if the room had been holding its breath for years and was unsure whether to exhale now that I had entered. I stood just inside the doorway, afraid that if I stepped too far in, something irreversible would happen. The walls were lined with shelves, floor to ceiling, filled with binders, books, and labeled boxes. Everything was neat. Almost obsessively so. No clutter. No randomness. This wasn't a workspace. It was an archive. I closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing louder than it should have. My heart pounded in my ears as I turned slowly, taking it all in. At the center of the room sat a large desk. Dark wood. Immaculate. Not a single scratch. On top of it lay one object, placed deliberately, as if Richard had known exactly where my eyes would go first. A folder. Cream-colored. Thick. My name typed neatly on the tab. I didn't want to open it. That was the strange part. After years of wondering, of accepting silence, of swallowing questions that burned the back of my throat, I suddenly wanted to turn around and walk away. Some doors, once opened, change not just what you know, but who you are. But Richard's words echoed in my head. Everything you need to know is inside. With shaking hands, I sat down and opened the folder. The first page wasn't what I expected. It wasn't financial statements, or legal documents, or anything dramatic. It was a photograph. I stared at it for a long time before understanding why my chest felt so tight. It was Richard. Younger. Much younger. Standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. They were both smiling, but not the polite, practiced smiles people wear in pictures. This was different. This smile was reckless. Happy in a way I had never seen on my husband's face. My fingers traced the edge of the photo. The woman had dark hair pulled back loosely, laughter caught mid-moment. Her hand rested casually on Richard's arm. Possessive. Familiar. On the back of the photo, in Richard's handwriting, were 3 words. Before everything broke. My knees weakened. I turned the page. What followed was a timeline. Dates. Locations. Names. Carefully written. Meticulously organized. I recognized some of the places, cities Richard had insisted we never visit. Events he had always declined. People he avoided without explanation. It wasn't an affair. It was a life. A whole life that existed before me, and alongside me, longer than I had ever imagined. Letters were clipped neatly behind the timeline. Dozens of them. Some handwritten. Some typed. All deeply personal. They weren't love letters in the way novels describe. There were no grand declarations or flowery promises. They were practical. Heavy. Written by people who had shared something dangerous. One letter made my hands tremble. If this ever comes out, it won't just destroy us. It will destroy everyone connected to us. Especially her. Me. I pushed back from the desk, suddenly nauseous. This wasn't betrayal in the way most people understand it. This was something deeper. More calculated. Richard hadn't hidden another woman from me. He had hidden himself. I spent hours in that room. Reading. Piecing together fragments of a man I had loved without ever fully knowing. Richard had once been part of something powerful. Something lucrative. Something that walked a fine line between legal and catastrophic. When it collapsed, it didn't just leave financial wreckage. It left people desperate, vengeful, and dangerous. He had walked away. Changed his name. Changed his life. Changed everything. Except the past. And then, he met me. I understood now. The rules. The secrecy. The locked door. The study hadn't been forbidden out of control. It had been forbidden out of fear. At the back of the room stood a filing cabinet I hadn't noticed before. Taller than the others. Newer. Unlike everything else in the study, it was locked. But the key sat on top of the cabinet. Waiting. I hesitated only a moment before unlocking it. Inside were documents I recognized immediately. Property deeds. Account statements. Trust agreements. My name appeared again and again. Not as a beneficiary. As an owner. As the primary holder. As the person with final authority. I sank to the floor, papers spilling from my hands. Richard hadn't just protected me emotionally. He had positioned me. Carefully. Quietly. 4 years. The last file in the drawer was marked with a red tab. In case of my death. Inside was a single letter. My love. You may feel angry. Confused. Betrayed. That is fair. But understand this. Everything I did was to make sure that when the past came knocking, and it always does, you would not be the one standing defenseless at the door. You were never meant to be small in this story. You were meant to finish it. Tears blurred the words. Finish it. Finish what? That night, I locked the study behind me for the first time. Not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because I finally understood its purpose. And as I stood in the hallway, holding the key in my palm, one thought echoed louder than all the others. Richard hadn't told me the truth while he was alive, because he needed me to survive it first. When the past knocked. The knock came just after dawn. Not loud. Not urgent. 3 slow taps. Measured, confident, as if whoever stood on the other side already knew I would open the door. I froze in the kitchen, my coffee untouched, Richard's letter still folded in the pocket of my robe like a warning I hadn't fully deciphered yet. The house felt different that morning. Less like a shelter. More like a stage. Quiet before a performance I hadn't rehearsed for. The knock came again. This time, firmer. I walked to the front door on legs that didn't quite feel like mine. Through the frosted glass, I saw only a silhouette. Tall, still, patient. When I opened the door, the man smiled like we were old acquaintances. "Mrs. Hale," he said smoothly. I was wondering how long it would take. I didn't answer. He was well dressed. Too well dressed for a casual visit. Dark coat. Crisp shirt. Eyes sharp enough to miss nothing. He glanced past me into the house, lingering just a second too long, as if he already knew its layout. "I'm sorry for your loss," he added, though his tone carried no sorrow. Richard was a complicated man. My fingers tightened around the doorframe. "Who are you?" I asked. His smile widened, just slightly. "Someone your husband hoped you'd never have to meet. I didn't invite him in. He stepped inside anyway. That should have been my first warning." He moved through my living room with familiarity, pausing by the bookshelf, the fireplace, the framed photo of Richard and me taken years ago at the lake. His gaze lingered there. "She looks kind," he said. "You." I swallowed. "What do you want?" He turned to face me, hands clasped loosely behind his back. "Truth. Closure. And possibly, restitution." The word hung heavy between us. "I don't know what you think, Richard." "Oh, I know exactly what Richard did," he interrupted gently. "What I'm interested in is whether you do." My mind raced. The study. The files. The letter. Finish it. "I'm his widow," I said carefully. "Anything you have to say can go through my lawyer." He laughed softly. "Oh, it will. Eventually. But first, I wanted to see you for myself." He took a step closer. "You see, Richard made arrangements. Contingencies. Safeguards. He was very thorough." My heart pounded. "And those arrangements," he continued, "put you in a rather powerful position." I said nothing. "Most people wouldn't expect that," he added. "You seem so ordinary." There it was. The underestimation. The same one Richard had counted on. He introduced himself as Daniel Mercer. The name meant nothing to me, until he mentioned the companies listed in Richard's timeline. The ones that had collapsed. The ones tied to lawsuits, settlements, and men who'd lost fortunes overnight. "I was there when it fell apart," Daniel said. "I lost more than money." He finally sat down, crossing one leg over the other like a man settling in for a long conversation. "Richard walked away clean," he said. "New name. New wife. New life." "And what?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Does that have to do with me?" Daniel studied my face. "Everything." He laid documents on my dining table. Copies. Bank transfers. Trust structures. Holdings that stretched farther than I had realized. "You see," he said, tapping one page, "Richard didn't just hide assets. He redistributed control." My breath caught as I recognized my signature. Old, scanned, from years ago. "He built layers," Daniel continued. "And at the center of them was you." I shook my head slowly. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," he said. "That's why it worked." Silence filled the room. Daniel leaned back. "Some people will come looking for what they believe is rightfully theirs," he said. "They'll pressure you, intimidate you, test you." He looked me straight in the eye. "And they'll assume you'll fold." I felt something shift inside me then. not fear. Focus. What happens if I don't? I asked. Daniel smiled. Then the past stays buried, he said. And the future belongs to you. After he left, I stood alone in the quiet house, his words echoing like a challenge. That afternoon, the calls began. Unknown numbers. Voicemails with polite voices masking sharp intentions. Emails from firms I'd never heard of, speaking in careful language about legacy obligations and amicable resolutions. Richard had been right. The past hadn't just knocked. It had arrived with an agenda. I went back to the study. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened drawers, cross-referenced files, followed the threads Richard had left behind like breadcrumbs meant only for me. And slowly, painfully, I began to understand. This wasn't about revenge. It was about survival and stewardship. Richard hadn't made me small to protect me. He had made me invisible, until the moment came to step forward. That night, I slept in the study chair. Not out of exhaustion, out of resolve. I held the key in my hand, the weight of it grounding me. Tomorrow, I would make my first call. Not to a lawyer. To the one name Richard had circled twice in red ink. Because if the past was determined to resurface, then it was time I met it standing tall. The moment I chose power. By the time the sun rose the next morning, I had already made my decision. Not the kind people announce. Not the kind that needs applause. The quiet kind. The irreversible kind. The kind that turns a life in a new direction while the world still believes you are standing still. I stood in the kitchen, holding Richard's final letter again, rereading the last line I had ignored before. When the time comes, do not defend yourself. Choose. 4 years I had defended. My marriage. My silence. My ignorance. I was done with that. The first call I made wasn't to a lawyer. It was to Margaret Lowell. Her name had been circled twice in Richard's handwriting, underlined once, then marked with a small symbol I didn't recognize. A woman's name among men. That alone told me something. She answered on the second ring. I was wondering when you'd call, she said calmly. No introduction. No surprise. I didn't know your husband, Margaret continued, but I knew his work, and I know what he left you. I closed my eyes. Then you know what's coming, I said. Yes, she replied. And you have about 48 hours before they stop pretending to be polite. That was all I needed to hear. We met that afternoon in a private office overlooking the river. Glass walls, clean lines, quiet authority. Margaret was in her late 60s, sharp-eyed, composed, dressed in a way that suggested power without needing to display it. She slid a folder toward me. Everything they want from you is in here, she said. And everything you actually control is here. She tapped a second folder. It was thicker, heavier. You don't need to fight them, she continued. You don't need to explain yourself. You only need to activate what already belongs to you. I swallowed hard. They think I'm weak, I said. Margaret smiled, not kindly, but knowingly. They always do. By evening, the tone of the messages changed. The politeness evaporated. The veiled threats sharpened. One voicemail stood out. Mrs. Hale, a man said smoothly, you're holding things you don't fully understand. It would be unwise to make unilateral decisions. I listened to it twice, then deleted it. For the first time since Richard's death, I didn't feel afraid. I felt centered. The next morning, I made my choice. Not in public. Not with drama. I signed 3 documents. Authorized 1 transfer. Revoked 2 permissions that had quietly allowed others to move around me for years. By noon, the balance shifted. By 3 o'clock, phones rang unanswered in offices across the city. By nightfall, Daniel Mercer showed up again. This time, he didn't smile. "You moved," he said carefully. "Yes," I replied. He studied me like a chessboard that had suddenly changed shape. "You understand what that means?" he asked. "I understand," I said softly, "that I won't be reacting anymore." Silence stretched between us. Then Daniel exhaled. "Richard underestimated one thing," he admitted. "What's that?" I asked. "You," he said. "He planned for threats, for enemies, for consequences." He looked at me with something close to respect, but not for choice. After he left, I walked through the house slowly. The study no longer felt like a forbidden space. It felt like a command center. Richard's secrets were no longer burdens. They were tools. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time since the funeral, because I finally understood something simple and terrifying. Power doesn't announce itself. It waits. The next morning, the first apology arrived. Not sincere, not humble, but desperate. And it would not be the last. When they beg, they didn't come loudly. That was the first thing I noticed. No raised voices. No sharp demands. No confident footsteps echoing through my hallway like before. They came carefully, as if the house itself might reject them. The first knock came just after noon. I was in the living room, sunlight spilling across the floor, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside me. I didn't move right away. I had learned the value of silence. Let it stretch. Let it do the work. The knock came again, softer this time. When I opened the door, Daniel Mercer stood there, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were two men I recognized immediately from Richard's files. Men whose names appeared beside words like trust, contingency, liability. Men who once believed they owned the future. Now they wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mrs. Hale," Daniel said, clearing his throat. "Thank you for agreeing to see us." I hadn't agreed, but I stepped aside anyway. They sat where Richard used to sit. That alone felt like justice. For a moment, no one spoke. The room hummed with restrained panic, the kind that comes when powerful people realize they are no longer steering the car. Finally, one of the men leaned forward. "We're prepared to discuss terms," he said. I smiled faintly. "You already had terms," I replied. "I just chose not to accept them." Daniel nodded. "Things have changed." "Yes," I said calmly. "They have." They laid it all out then. The pressure they were under. The deals unraveling. The investigations quietly circling. They spoke quickly, stumbling over explanations, over reassurances, over promises they could no longer guarantee. And then came the word they never expected to say to me. Help. It landed heavy in the room. I waited. I had learned that power often speaks last. "There's something you should know," I said finally. All three men stiffened. I reached for the envelope I had prepared that morning and slid it across the table. Daniel opened it. His face changed instantly. Color drained. Jaw tightened. The other men leaned in, reading over his shoulder. And that's when the final truth revealed itself. Richard hadn't just prepared for betrayal. He had documented it. Every quiet maneuver. Every redirected fund. Every false assurance. And he hadn't left it to chance. He had left it to me. "This doesn't need to go any further," I said softly. "If you walk away. If you undo what you've done. If you stop. And if we don't," one man asked hoarsely. I met his eyes for the first time. "Then I won't protect you anymore." The silence that followed was absolute. They left without shaking my hand. Without threats. without confidence. By evening, the calls stopped. The pressure vanished. And for the first time, the house felt truly mine. Not haunted. Not heavy. Just quiet. Later that night, I returned to the study one last time. I stood where Richard once stood, surrounded by the life he hid, not out of cruelty, but out of caution. I understand now, I whispered into the empty room. Not forgiveness. Understanding. I closed the door gently. Some rooms don't need to be opened again. Some truths only need to be known once. I stepped outside onto the porch, the air cool against my skin, the stars sharp and steady overhead. Tomorrow I would begin something new. Not louder. Not harder. Just stronger. Because once you choose power, there is no returning to being invisible. And those who once underestimated you, they learn to remember your name. The woman who walked away whole. Morning came quietly. No sirens. No frantic calls. No knocks at the door. Just sunlight spilling through the curtains like it had every right to be there. I woke up lighter than I had in years. Not because everything was over, but because I was no longer waiting for permission to live. I made coffee the way Richard used to, strong, no sugar. Then I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had once signed papers I didn't fully understand, trusted smiles that didn't deserve it, and believed silence was safety. I smiled to myself. Silence had been a cage. Now it was peace. The news arrived by email. Short. Formal. Careful. The partnerships were dissolving. The pressure had shifted. The men who came begging had chosen survival over pride. Exactly as Richard predicted. Exactly as I allowed. By noon, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed inside it, but because I had. For the first time, I wasn't living in a legacy someone else built. I was standing in my own. I went back to the study one final time. Not to investigate. Not to uncover. But to say goodbye. The room no longer frightened me. The shadows no longer whispered. The secrets had lost their power the moment I chose myself over fear. I ran my fingers along the desk. You didn't hide this because you didn't trust me, I said softly. You hid it because you knew who I could become. I understood that now. That afternoon, I donated the files I didn't need, to the right hands, quietly, legally, cleanly. Power doesn't need noise. It needs precision. In the evening, I dressed up, not for anyone else, but for me. A simple dress. Pearls. My reflection looked back at me differently. Not older. Stronger. Whole. I stepped outside as the sun dipped low, neighbors waving politely, unaware of the storm that had passed through my life and left me standing. And that's when it hit me. This story wasn't about Richard. It wasn't about the men who betrayed him. It wasn't even about secrets. It was about a woman who spent years believing she was less, until the day she chose to stop shrinking. If you're listening to this right now, let me tell you something I wish someone had told me sooner. Being underestimated is not a weakness. It's a strategy you didn't know you were holding. Let them talk. Let them doubt. Let them assume. But never forget, your quiet does not mean your absence. Your patience does not mean your power is gone. And when the moment comes, you don't need revenge. You need clarity. I locked the study door and handed the key to no one. Some power is meant to be carried, not displayed. So tell me, where are you watching from? And have you ever been underestimated, only to realize later it was your greatest advantage? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe, and remember, once you choose your power, you never go back to being invisible again.